Well, I was excited to hear they're passing out shirts. I still don't have one, and I work here. And I also heard you talking about nerds, and I'm certainly one of those. And to that end, I was reading a book recently by a French-Canadian philosopher, which already sounds boring now that I say it out loud. And this French-Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor, wrote a book called A Secular Age. And in the book, A Secular Age, what he's doing is he's trying to explain why the world we live in has gone secular. Why is the world secular now? What happened to lead us to this point? And it's a fascinating book. I do not encourage you to read it because it is so boring. But he had some fascinating insights in it. And he wanted to explain that secularism, as I explained in our class, Theology is for Everyone, that we just wrapped up last week. I explained that secularism, according to Taylor, is not a story of subtraction. It's not the world minus God. In fact, it is allowing for different people to have different opinions. The world is secular because we have allowed people to hold different opinions. Because we, as Protestants, believe that you can't force somebody to believe something. You have to compel them to believe it. You can't force them to. And he explains that the reason why this is true is because we are not primarily shaped by propositional truths. We are shaped by the stories we believe to be true. We are shaped by the stories that we hear and that we tell and that we believe. And so my question for you as we head into this Christmas season is fundamentally this. What is the story that you are telling? What is the story that you believe? What is your story? We all have stories to tell. Some of these stories are good, some of these stories are bad, but all of them may be true. Some of the good stories may be like your story is that you grew up in a hard situation and you overcame and you're successful now. Praise God. Maybe that's your story. Maybe your story is you broke generational trauma in your family history. Praise the Lord. Maybe your story is finding love and marrying someone you didn't think you could possibly live up to. Some of the stories we tell ourselves are just fantasies, right? Like if I would have just done something a little different, I would have made professional sport. I would have been in the NFL if I would have just done this. Or if I would have said something different, that girl would have said yes. Or if I would have just done this a little different, I would have gotten that dream job. Or that dream house, or that dream car. Some of the stories we tell are hard stories in this Christmas season. Some of these stories are the ones where we believe that we aren't good enough to be loved. Some of the stories that we tell ourselves is a story of grief in the holiday season. Maybe your story is that you wish that your kid or your parent or your spouse would listen to you because you don't feel heard or loved or seen. Or maybe your story is if I make a little more money, things would get better. Maybe your story is the whole world is working against me and I can't get out from underneath the weight that's on me. We all have stories we tell. And many of these stories are true. And I don't want to minimize that in any way because we live in a fallen world and our stories that we tell are true and some of them are hard. Some of them are difficult to live with. Especially in this holiday season where for some of us, we don't feel joy when Christmas time comes around. Sometimes for some of us, Christmas is difficult. It's hard because our story is a story of loss in the Christmas season. Our story is one of going without. Our story is one of doubting God in this Christmas season. And these stories are true stories, and they shape the reality we live in. And I want to say again, these stories are true, and in this Christmas season, you shouldn't pretend these stories are not really what is true. That is not what Christmas is about, is pretending that your life isn't real. But today, I want to tell you the truest of all stories. You see, there are stories that you tell that are true, but there is a greater story that is also true. And in fact, it is more true. And it overshadows all the other stories we tell, and they paint the rest of our stories in a different light if we believe this story to be true. It changes our perspective if we believe in the truest of all stories. The truest of all stories is the reason for the season. It's the reason that we gather. It's the reason we are here. And this story doesn't make the other stories untrue, but it helps us put them in perspective. So bear with me today, because what I want to do is I want to retell the story that is the truest of all stories, because our minds are not shaped by propositional truths that I can tell you on this Christmas day. The pain doesn't go away because I told you some true fact. But maybe if we hear the true story, it will change our perspective. This is a story of addition. This isn't a story of subtraction. Something wasn't taken away, something was given. You see, the story begins in a garden. When God began to create the skies and the ground, He made things good. And He took humanity and life, or as we call them, Adam and Eve, and He put them in a mountaintop garden, the Garden of Delight, or as we know it, Eden. And He gave them everything they needed. They even had jobs to do. And their job was to spread the goodness that they found in that garden, that God had put in that garden, to the ends of the earth. Their job was to take what they had and continue to spread the goodness around the entire world. God said, there's a way that you can live that would lead to the flourishing of the entire earth. Everything would go well. And all you needed to do, all they needed to do was trust that God's story was true. Then a snake came and cast doubt on the words of God. He spoke to the woman in the garden, and she saw what she thought was good, and she ate. And she gave to the man that was with her, and he ate. They decided they were going to choose what was good and what was bad, instead of trusting what God said was good. And immediately they were filled with guilt and shame. They began to hide themselves. They began to cover up their own pain, their own shame, because of what they felt inside. And they began to blame one another, and they couldn't trust each other anymore because of what they were feeling, because of what they did, because they decided for themselves what was good. Things began to fracture. But in that moment, God looked at the woman and the snake and the man, and He promised that even though they messed things up, that one day He would make things right. One day there will be somebody who comes and crushes that snake. That one that brought evil into the world, the one that started this whole problem, that was one day going to go away. That was one day going to be destroyed by a descendant of the woman. But the snake had tricked them, and the world began to fall apart. They are no longer allowed in the garden. The earth stopped working the way it was supposed to, and the next story, the first son was killed by the second son. The downward spiral had begun. They had been deceived, and yet there was still hope that one day someone would come and put an end to all of this. The story moves forward, as it always does, and things don't improve. In fact, they worsen. It is written that the hearts of the people turn entirely toward evil, as if that was the only thing people knew. And God looked down on the chaos and the disorder and the evil, and he said, "No more." Yet even in his judgment, there was a kind of grace. He found one man, a descendant of the woman, Noah, and his family, and he saved them from the flood that swept everything away. And he took them back on top of a mountain, and Noah planted a garden, and it seems that we are getting a new start. But immediately, things go downhill. The downward spiral starts as soon as they leave the boat. The story doesn't change. Not really. Moses fails, his children fails, and down we go again. So generations later, we see the world is a mess again. And again, God chooses to work with another man who's descended from the woman, named Abram. And God tells them that he will work with him and that through him the entire world will be blessed. This is sounding a lot like where we started again. And God works with humanity, and his goal is that the whole world would be blessed because of Abram. The problem is that Abram fails again and again. And Isaac, his son, fails. And Jacob, Isaac's son, fails. And Jacob's 12 children fail. And they end up enslaved in a foreign country for 400 years. The story we consistently see is God working with these people and the people rebelling. He promised to be faithful to these people, and they rebelled. And in their slavery, hope began to dwindle. Is salvation coming? The ruler of the land, they were enslaved and even went so far as to kill all the children. But in that time, God provided hope. He raised up Moses. And Moses brought the people out of their slavery and out of their despair, and he brought them to another mountaintop and gave them another chance. But before they could even finish making the agreement, again, the people failed. The story goes on, always the same. A promise made by God, a promise broken by humanity. A glimmer of hope and then failure. The spiral continues. Always downward, always waiting for someone to put an end to it all. And by now, we would hope that, something would change, but it doesn't. We begin retracing familiar steps, returning to the same beginning again and again. Eventually, the people get into the land that was promised to Abraham. And there's a glimmer of hope at first. They conquer a city. And that's how long it takes for them to begin to fail again. And the pattern comes over and over. They take the land, but not all of it. They make truces with people that they weren't supposed to. The conquest isn't even completed, really. 2 of the 12 tribes decide they're not even going to go on the right side of the river. They're just going to stay where they are because it feels nice. They establish themselves in the land, and the generations that follow are described as saying, everyone does what is right in their own eyes and in their own view. Or to put it another way, everyone is doing evil. This is the story of the judges where if you read the story, they become worse than all the surrounding nations. They were supposed to be a light to all the other nations, and they become worse than all the other nations. And at this point, we might even lose sight of what we're even waiting for. How much story has been told, and there's been no deliverance. It has been countless years since that promise in that garden. The one about a descendant who would crush the head of the serpent and put an end to evil. But it seems that nobody is coming. No one's doing it. And the people think, well, perhaps a king is going to solve this problem. If only we had a ruler like all the other nations, maybe that would solve the problem. And so they ask God for a king, and God gives them the one they asked for in Saul, and that goes terribly. And God anoints another man named David. He's the anointed one, or in Hebrew, he's the Messiah. And David seems to be different. He seems to be doing things the way that God asks him to. He seems to trust God. And there is even a story about a big, scary man that is described to look like a snake, who David kills. And then he cuts off his head, and it's like, wait, is this it? Is this the person we've been waiting for? And so God makes a covenant with David. He says, I'm going to work with you, and I'm going to make you great among all the nations. And then the next page, David sees what he thinks is good, and he takes it. And the downward spiral starts again. His sons start killing each other. The daughters are taken advantage of. Evil goes throughout the land. And the kings from that point on, there are dozens. And you could count on one hand who did what was right. So God raises up prophets to tell the people the words of God. And they follow the same pattern. They say, hey, you guys are sinning. And if you don't turn back to God, the day of the Lord, judgment will come. But they would always have this message of hope as well. Don't worry, the Messiah is going to come. That one we've been waiting for will eventually get here. And the people harden their hearts, and they don't listen. The day of the Lord comes for Israel, just as the prophets warned. Israel loses their land. And a few more prophets come. And then one day, they stop. No more prophets. No more words from God. Silence. For 400 years. And this is the point that I wanted us to get to in the Christmas story. This is where I wanted us to be, because this is the story of the people before the coming of Christ. They had been promised a rescuer. They were promised that somebody was going to come and deliver them from evil, and then they just hear this story of failure after failure. No one ever came. And I hope in the hearing and the retelling of the story, you'd have this anticipation that one day there would be a conclusion, or at least I would conclude talking. But the idea is that this anticipation, this hope, is what this Advent season is about. This is what we are supposed to feel in this time. See, Christmas isn't just a propositional truth. Advent isn't just an idea, it's a felt reality. Think of all those people and how they must have been feeling, seeing all the wickedness and evil and the pagan kings winning, the world succeeding. How would they feel? It's like, I thought we were putting an end. God, I thought you were there, and why aren't you talking to us anymore? There's wickedness, there's disease, there's famine, there's poverty, there's war. Where are you, God? Could you imagine waiting 400 years and not hearing anything? I don't even know how to put into perspective 400 years. It's like a different world 400 years ago. My kids can't even wait until Christmas to unwrap their presents. 400 years? I mean, you'd think that some people are like, well, maybe Grandpa was just hearing something. Maybe he was just making stuff up. We haven't heard from God, and nobody I know has heard from God, so maybe this was just a fairy tale. And with that anticipation built, we come to Luke 2, where there's a man named Simeon, as we read earlier, who worshiped in the temple every single day because he believed the story. He trusted that the story that he had been told was the true story. And every day he would go and worship in that temple. And God saw him. And God answered his daily prayers that he would see the consolation of Israel. He would not die until he saw that snake-crushing king. How many years passed, you think? How many prayers had been offered up? And then one day, he sees the baby. The baby's there. And he took him full of excitement. He said, I can die now. It's fine. Like, God has kept his promise. God has been faithful. This is the day we've been hoping for. Do you see? Like, God has done it. Salvation has come. Things aren't going to be this way forever. God said he was going to come. He said he was going to bring salvation, and salvation is here. And the hope of Simeon was met by the faithfulness of God. Joy had come. The peace he had been looking for was here. This was it. And this is why we celebrate Christmas, because evil has come into the world and we live in a world full of evil, but God did not leave it that way. There were promises made and there were promises kept. And this is the truest of all stories. God said he would, and God did. And the world still is full of evil. Many of us may be feeling like this world is still a horrible place. I'm still hurting. I'm still suffering. I'm still being taken advantage of. My story is still a story of pain. And those things are still true. And that's the purpose of this Christmas season. Your story is true, but we need to regularly remind ourselves of a greater story. Our story is that every single person who has ever lived, every single person who has been a part of this has contributed to the chaos and the disorder that we have seen. We've decided for ourselves what was right and what was wrong. We didn't listen to God. We didn't hear his word. But God, as he did time and time again throughout the Old Testament, was faithful. He promised that he would come, and he kept his word. That snake-crushing king came in that manger those 2,000 years ago. The way the world is right now is not how it's always going to be. And we need to make sure that we are telling ourselves this true story every single year. Taylor talks about this in his book as well. He goes on to say that there are two ways of looking at time. There are two ways of looking at time. The first way of looking at time is chronologically. This is how we normally think about time, right? There's going to be today and then there's tomorrow. There's another way of looking at time, and this is what we do at Christmas time. You know that feeling around Christmas time that comes every year? There's something about time. He calls it a high time where we feel something. And that's what we're doing. That's why we go through this. That's why we light these candles every year, is because what we're doing is we're retelling the story over and over again. We're visiting that Christmas time. There's a sense in which when we look at Christmas time, we are closer during the Christmas season than we were like 3 months ago, because we feel the way they felt during this time. And so don't miss this as we go through our routines, as we do our things. Don't just check off a list of boxes. Remember that Christmas feels a way for a reason. We do this intentionally to build out the truth that we believe, the stories that we need to tell, because if we don't tell ourselves the stories over and over again, we will believe some of those other stories are the only true story. We'll begin to tell ourselves false stories and believe that that's the extent of reality, when we should know that the truest story is one day going to make all those things, all the evil, become untrue. Think of the story of Lord of the Rings, as I always do, where Sam has traveled to Mount Doom, and on the journey, his friend Gandalf, he thought had died. And he thought he himself had died. And then, at the end of it all, once the climax of the story was over, I don't want to ruin it 70 years later, but as the climax of the story happens, Sam sees Gandalf and he says, "What? Can this be? I thought you were dead. And I thought I was dead. Does this mean that all things, all the sad things, will come untrue?" And that's what we can say, is that one day all these sad things, all these hard things, all the pain that we feel, all the anxiety, all the struggle we have are one day going to become untrue. Because God kept his word 2,000 years ago. So I can look ahead and say he's going to keep his word again, because he always has. So when we hurt, we don't ignore these hurts because they're real. We can't pretend they're not real. They are real. Our pain and our hurt, our suffering is real. But we can endure because we know that there's a truer story, that there's something even greater at play. The author Kay Fuller says it this way: whether it's our sin or another's, whether it's death, divorce, loss, brokenness, loneliness, financial strain, sickness, injury, or more that seeks to crush us this Christmas, we can flip the world's script and instead remember that these are in fact why we have Christmas. Thanks be to God who crushed it at Christmas and at Easter and forevermore. Amen. So my question to you is, what story are you telling yourself? What story are you believing this Christmas? Which one are you meditating on? The goal of this season that we're in, this Advent season, the time before Christmas, is a time of anticipation. We spend 4 weeks anticipating December 25th. And it's to remind us of the thousands of years that the Jewish people spent anticipating their Messiah. And that anticipation, that eager longing that we see in the children especially, but we also feel in our own heart, are just there to remind us of what's ultimately true, the truest of all stories. We're in a waiting period right now, and the full celebration happens in a few days. So to mark this time, what we do is we light candles. One candle we light to remind us of the hope we have. One candle we light to remind us of the peace that Christ brought. One to remind us of the joy of our salvation. And the last one that we light before Christ comes is to remind us of the love of God. It's kind of on fire. And then there's a fifth candle that we light on Christmas. And it's a celebration of all the other candles. It is the peak of the season when we celebrate that truest of all truths, that greatest of all joys. So this week, if you have Advent candles, I encourage you, Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, light that fifth candle and remember and celebrate and rehearse the story that we've been told. The Messiah has come, and one day he will come again. And everything sad is going to come untrue.